Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Mon nom est Catherine Lévesque et je serai votre modératrice aujourd'hui. So today we have a press conference on the Senate committee releasing a report on forced and coerced sterilization. We are joined by three senators today. The chair of the committee, Senator Salma Atulajan, Senator Yvonne Boyer, member of the committee, and également en virtuel, nous avons
And also virtually, we have Senator Michelle Odette, a former member of the committee, who will be joining us virtually to talk about their findings. So I will allow the senators to take the floor, and then there will be questions.
You're ready.
So I acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. The people of this nation are the original stewards of the land we reside on, and it is important to show our respect for their stewardship of this land by acknowledging them every day. Hello and welcome. My name is Senator Salma Atulajan, and I am chair of the Human Rights Committee, Senate Human Rights Committee. I am joined by my colleagues, Senator Yvonne Boyer and Senator Michelle Odette, as well as a very special guest who you will meet in just a few minutes. Today, the Committee on Human Rights is releasing its report on the practice of forced and coerced sterilization in Canada, the scars that we carry. Sterilization is a surgical procedure to prevent conception if the procedure is performed without the patient's free and prior and informed consent. It is considered forced or coerced. For most people, the idea of being forcibly stripped of your ability to conceive is unthinkable, in fact, horrifying. But this disturbing practice has a long history in this country, and it persists today. The victims will surprise no one. Indigenous, Black, racialized, and disabled women have borne the brunt of this inhumane treatment. With great courage, some have begun to fight back. In recent years, a number of survivors have gone public. Class action suits have been launched in multiple provinces on behalf of Indigenous women who say they were forced or coerced into being sterilized. Our committee launched a preliminary study into the history and scope of forced and coerced sterilization in Canada in 2019. We released our report in 2021 and resumed our investigation this year. We heard testimony from 19 witnesses, including some survivors of forced or coerced sterilization, whose bravery and determination to spare other women from this cruel treatment strengthened our own resolve to act. On behalf of the Senate Committee of Human Rights, I extend our heartfelt gratitude to all survivors who spoke to us. With such compelling evidence before us, government, healthcare practitioners, medical associations, professional governing and licensing bodies must make sure that no other person in Canada is pressurized, manipulated, or threatened into losing the ability to bring life into this world. I will now turn the microphone over to Senator Boyer, who will speak in more detail about the committee's findings. And Senator Odette will conclude our presentation by highlighting some of the committee's key recommendations. We will then be pleased to take questions. Thank you. Senator Boyer.
Thank you, Senator Atulajan. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge the bravery of the survivors who came forward and told their powerful truths to the committee. To them, I say merci, miigwech. Each and every one of you have made a difference. By speaking your truths, you have helped blaze a trail for the others to speak up. One by one, survivors of forced and coerced sterilization are speaking out and saying, no more. Their truths have guided our work, and their truths must continue to guide the way forward. The testimony that we heard was passionate, it was moving, and for many, shocking. But for those of us who have lived with or experienced racism in Canada's healthcare system, these stories are all too familiar. The report details the many findings that arose from our study of this issue. Each section is worthy of its own press conference, but I'll highlight some for you now. All the survivors who testified before our committee described how they were sterilized without their free, prior, and informed consent. These scenarios included medical staff outright threatening patients and misinforming them about the need for sterilization. In some cases, medical staff did not request consent at all. The study also underscored the link between racism in Canada's healthcare system and the practice of forced and coerced sterilization. The survivors who testified were unequivocal. They believed that racism was the driving force behind their unwanted sterilizations. Additionally, the repercussions of forced and coerced sterilization are extensive, lasting, and devastating. On top of the trauma of undergoing the procedure itself, witnesses described long-term health and psychological effects, including depression, anxiety, and loss of trust in the medical system. The finding that struck me the most was the deep-rooted impact of sterilization on entire communities and future generations. How those who were born into families affected by sterilization would have had greater responsibilities and burdens placed upon them. Forced sterilization disrupts and breaks the natural laws that Indigenous peoples have followed since time immemorial. After hearing the compelling testimony during this study, I drafted and introduced Bill S-250 in the Senate chamber in late June. This bill would make it a criminal offense to sterilize someone against their will or without their consent. It's a direct response to the calls we heard during the study. Passing this bill quickly would heed one of the report's key recommendations, which my colleague, Senator Audette, will speak to shortly. I will now read a statement from one of our survivors who testified before our committee, Nicole Rabbit. Her Blackfoot name is Eagle Woman. She is a First Nations woman from the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta. She is the mother of 4 children, 2 sons, 2 daughters, and has 3 grandsons. When asked what she would like to share with you all today, she had the following to say. I am speaking for myself. However, my mother, too, was coerced into being sterilized shortly after she had me. This limited the number of my family members and my children. Being the anchor of my family and family ties, I've been attacked by a system that wished harm on the continuance of my family and ancestral lineage. It's simply genocide, limiting the number of my immediate family unit, my relatives, members of my tribe, and Indigenous existence. In the past, children were placed in the center of our communal life and protected by the elders, the women, and men. The government then created residential schools to take away and remove the Indigenous children from their parents, family, and tribe, which affected the whole tribe. Once the children were removed from the tribe, the parental roles changed. The parents and members of the tribe were lonely and brokenhearted. This act traumatized my people and still does today. My father was diagnosed with throat cancer last year. He never smoked cigarettes his whole life. I believe all his hurt built up in his throat, as today it is difficult for him to share his experience at residential school. If that was not enough, Indigenous women were targeted and forced or coerced to be sterilized. Their human rights were violated. My human rights were violated. The children I could have were violated. How was this allowed to happen to my mother? This is intergenerational genocide with intent in the eyes of the law. These acts committed were planned. Therefore, it is criminal intent. These acts of genocide were controlled factors that destroyed the Indigenous family dynamics. We are communal people who support and take care of each other, where all members of the tribe have a role to play. My grandparents, on my maternal and paternal side, had many children, giving me over 40 first cousins. We were blessed to have unlimited support from all family members to care for the young, the elderly, and ones with health issues. Today, my children have very few first cousins, brothers and sisters to turn to for support, due to my mother and myself being coerced to be sterilized. Questions I have and want answers to for when my children or grandchildren ask about this tragic history of systemic racism are: who has the right to put a monetary value on human life? Who authorized these invasive, inhumane, genocidal procedures? Who is going to hold those institutions accountable for the genocidal tactics of forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women and the protection of their unborn child? Thank you.
Senator Odette.
Merci, Sénatrice Atulajan.
Thank you, Senator Atulajan, and thank you so much to my colleague, Senator Boyer. I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of Ganawage. Now, this is a subject that is still very present. You've heard from my colleagues, and there are two major questions to be addressed. How can we rectify the situation of those women who were completely abandoned by the system? And how can we guarantee that this practice will never happen again, no matter where they live in this great country? In this report, we have 13 recommendations which have been thought out, reflected on, and inspired by people who have gone through this, people who've had the courage to talk to us. These recommendations are for the federal government, and we urge the government to make an official apology to all these women, to all these persons, in order that all Canadians who were subjected to forced or coerced sterilization may hear this, and that this may help them. But what's important is that we have to realize is that even official apologies will not give back to these survivors what they lost. But it would be a very significant gesture on the part of the Canadian government. It would mean that the government has admitted that this is something that happened in Canada and that it's real, and also that it's unacceptable. In its report, the committee has asked the federal government to come up with a compensation regime for survivors, and above all, they should do so with these women. The process should be guided by these women, and it should bear in mind the direct and indirect harm to these women. Senator Boyer talked to you about a bill. So what we're recommending is that this forced or coerced sterilization become a criminal act. Now, on June 14th, today, my colleague presented this bill, S-250, and we heard from Indigenous women, women from various regions Canada-wide, and we can no longer ignore this. This was shameful and unacceptable, and there was so little value granted to these people. We also recommend that Canada adopt measures to help these people in Indigenous and racialized communities. Of course, we're also urging the government to take every necessary measure to follow calls to action 23 and 24. A great many Indigenous people in the medical world, and we need to make these people medical or health professionals, we need to make them aware of all this. Recommendations are on page 41 of the report, and they have to be understood and known. Although these recommendations are addressed to the federal government, we also urge provincial and territorial governments, professional bodies, licensing bodies, to realize that they also have a role to play in protecting future generations. These are our mothers, our sisters, our grandmothers who have been affected by this. I want to thank all those who helped us, and I want to thank my colleagues, my fellow senators. Thank you, Senator. We'll now move to the questions.
People in the room, and people on Zoom will go to you afterwards. If you do have a question, please use the raised hand function to indicate that you do have one. Donc, en commençant dans la salle,
So we'll begin.
just go to one of the mics. Oh, apologies. You do have the mic in front of you. Sorry for that. That's been a little change. Donc, on va commencer avec Valérie Gamache.
So we'll start with Valérie Gamache. Yes, good morning. I'm from Radio-Canada. Madam, you speak French, Senator? No? Okay, fine. Senator Odette, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the notion of consent. Because what should be done, in your opinion, so that we can come to an acceptable consent process? Well, there are witnesses who explained what the situation was before, during, and after. And they talked to us about the collateral damage and the fact that they could no longer reverse the damage. It's important to understand that when someone is in a situation of vulnerability, perhaps that woman has been told what's happening and often not told what's happening. And we haven't had all the resource people in place to make sure this person has understood that if she accepts what's being imposed on her, what's being suggested to her, well, by listening to two of our witnesses, we learned that this was something that was supposed to help them, but they didn't understand, and afterwards it was too late. So consent for me, it means making sure that everyone takes the time to explain to the person what's happening and to allow that person to make a decision, not when they've had an epidural. And my colleagues will be able to talk to you about the medical aspects. But there are people, because they're in pain or are afraid, they're not able to make this kind of decision. So there have to be people around us to take the time to explain what's happening. And these people have to understand that someone is not ready to make this kind of decision. Question. In your recommendations, your recommendation to make forced sterilization a criminal act, who is responsible? Is it the doctor? Who is guilty of the offense or putatively guilty? Well, I think my colleague, Senator Boyer, with her bill, given that it's her bill, she will be better placed to tell you who it might be. Would it be a nurse or nurses? Is it the attending physician. I wouldn't want to hazard an answer to that. We think that we should be able at least to say that the various professional bodies have done due diligence.
The doctor in charge, and it would, the bill would actually lay out a consent form on how to actually gain consent that would be inclusive of, say, 4 pillars, like looking at capacity, making sure that there's no deception, no coercion, making sure that there's adequate time taken for that person to be able to understand what the consent means. We heard many issues coming from the survivors that consent was given when they didn't understand what the doctor was saying. So the whole issue of consent is a really big problem. And I believe it's probably been the main concern that we need to deal with. Within this bill, we have consent addressed in the bill. We also have a final consent as well, that the patients are provided one last opportunity before the procedure takes place if they have consented. Because one thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to remove the agency from women to be able to consent to a tubal ligation. But we have to be sure that free, prior, and informed consent has been given.
Just to add to that, just to add to that, it is an offense under one or more of the sections of the criminal code, but I think we heard to this date there has been no consequences for anyone who has committed these acts. So it is a criminal offense under sections 265, 267, and 268. That's assault causing body harm, and aggravated assault. But we did not hear of consequences for anyone who did do forced sterilization.
That's correct.
APTN?
Hi. So Fraser Needham, APTN National News. So yeah, I was just going to follow up on the criminal code or changes to the criminal code. I guess you're a number of provinces. Healthcare is a provincial responsibility, and my understanding is a number of provinces have said that they will not do this procedure, won't be doing this procedure further, and they said provincial healthcare systems are no longer performing these acts. Also, as you mentioned, it's already in the criminal code as an assault. So why, I guess my question is, why is it necessary to make changes to the criminal code and make for this to be an offense?
Okay, I can answer that. Well, what we've seen so far hasn't worked because we've had, I believe there's sterilizations happening today as we speak. The calls that I get in my office tell me that women are still being coerced into sterilization. Women that are pregnant even are being coerced into having that tubal ligation. And so what we've seen up to date really hasn't worked. We know that there's women that have joined the class actions in 2019. We heard from one of the survivors that was sterilized in 2018 when she was 24 years old with 2 children. So we need to have some extra teeth. And I think that passing this bill might make them stop and think a little bit more before they actually do something like that again.
If I can add, Sénatrice Boyer, with this, I strongly believe that if a woman or a family knows that there is a legislation that exists in Canada to protect her, specifically for this, we're giving a voice, dignity, and a chance to make sure that she use her rights. Because even if it's there, it was well explained by my 2 colleagues, when we don't know, maybe we don't use it, or maybe the jurisprudence is not clear. The path is not worth to go there. But when we have something very clear, the accountability will be very important from the government, from the person who committed the crime, or the ordre professionnel. So I'm a strong believer that we have to attach this to a legislation.
Yeah, and sorry, my follow-up would be, how difficult has it been to obtain reliable data on this issue?
A lot of the, well, actually in Saskatchewan, on their healthcare cards, status Indians have an R. So the data, getting it from Saskatchewan is not as difficult as other provinces, because when they show the hospital their card, it identifies them immediately as being First Nations and subject to probably worse health care than somebody that doesn't have an R on their card. So the data in Saskatchewan we've been able to access that. We are accessing data from various sources. My office has been acting like a clearinghouse, actually. So we've been doing everything that we can to bring as much data to the forefront as possible. However, that's one of our recommendations, is to get a very reliable data system in, and to be able to know for sure how many people have been sterilized against their will. Right now, we have over 100 that have joined the Saskatchewan class action lawsuit. We have class actions going in Alberta, BC, and most of the other provinces. And my office has done anecdotal research with many of the researchers throughout Canada, and we have counted 12,000. So we know that this has occurred for a long time, and my office does get calls on a regular basis about it still occurring.
And by having this recommendation 11, if I remember, I hope it will send a message also to the region where I live in Quebec, where this mobilization, when it started, the government didn't want to participate. The Quebec government didn't want to participate to this table or to this dialogue. So I believe that if we go ahead with that, many of us who lives in Quebec as senators or as a representative from a grassroots organization, we can remind the importance of collaboration and making sure that also we add the numbers and the statistic to this data.
Is that data is scarce because there's a certain amount of shame and trauma attached to this process, and a lot of the victims do not know their rights, and they do not know where they can go, who they can speak to. So, for example, it has been documented that 1,000 sterilizations occurred just in northern Canada and in federally operated Indian hospitals. So there's many aspects of this, that not knowing your rights, not knowing what help is available, and the shame and the trauma that is attached to it. So people who it's happened to might not necessarily come forward and speak.
Juste avant de passer à la prochaine question.
Before moving to the next question, Michelle Odette, could you please repeat what you said about the government, about what the message being sent to the government of Quebec in French? Yes, Ms. Gamache. If I understand the Quebec legislation, before I went to the Senate, the provinces and territories were invited to work together and pool their expertise. And in our beautiful, my beautiful region of Quebec, well, there were no government delegates sent there. If they did, I will be happy to apologize. Because what we did would it helps senators from Quebec to remind the government of how important it is to take part in a national data gathering and to make sure that this is shared all over Canada, including Quebec. Thank you.
I'd like to also add onto that. From the work that I do, I go to different parts of Canada and I speak to groups of women that have come together that have an interest in this issue. I was in northern Manitoba and speaking about my experience doing the external review, my experience as an academic and a professional, and afterwards there was people lined up all the way out the door to come and talk to me. Over half of those women had been sterilized against their will. And another story, and this happens all over when I go speak, because people will come forward, they'll say, well, it happened to me. I haven't told anybody. I haven't told anybody since it happened 20 years ago. And the stories that I get, and there's one quite remarkable one that I want to share, that one night, late at night, I was in a hotel in Saskatchewan, and I was the only person in the lobby, and the young woman behind the desk said to me, oh, you're the famous senator. And I said, well, I'm a senator, but I'm not very famous. And she said, you're the senator of sterilization. And I said, well, that's an area that I work in. And she was a young, beautiful Indigenous woman. And she looked at me and her eyes welled up. And she said, they did it to me when I was 21. And now I'm 35. My children have grown. I want children. I have a new partner. I can't have children. I can't afford IVF. Well, it was such a touching moment for me because it turned me into a puddle. Her and I are hugging and crying, and it was such an emotional time. And I see this all the time. These young women, 35 years old, they've sterilized me. I need IVF. I don't have $15,000 for that. That's why we're talking about these recommendations. And the recommendations of compensation and looking at the women that have been sterilized and being able to help them. There was the young woman that I mentioned earlier that was sterilized when she was 24 years old, and she's 28 now. She's, in her testimony, she says, we're saving up. We're saving up so we can try to have a baby. She doesn't, she's poor. She works at Tim Hortons. Anyway, that was my comments. Thank you.
Good morning, Marina von Stackelberg with CBC News. Obviously, this bill is hoping to prevent this practice. Are you hoping that it offers anything to the survivors that have had this done to them, and what would that be?
I would like to see a government compensation package. I would like to see a holistic approach. We've studied this. This happened in many other parts of the world as well. We've been working with Peru. Peru, over 200,000 Indigenous women were sterilized in the Fujimori regime. Now these women have come together and said, no more. We want compensation, and they won their case. And they have a compensation package that looks at a holistic way of dealing with this pain that doesn't just affect one person, because we hear this from the survivors as well. They don't trust the hospital. They don't trust the system. They don't even let their kids go. They're in danger. They need a healthcare system, and they need reparation that is addressed to them, to their special needs as a survivor of this. We've heard from Nicole Rabbit, who talked about her whole family being affected for generations and generations. And this is what I think needs to happen. We need to look at a holistic approach at how can we help these women and their families and the legacy that is coming from each sterilization of the cutting of those fallopian tubes. My comments.
And we need to have the trust that was broken. We need to have that trust restored. We need for these women to feel safe when they go into hospitals or they go into any kind of healthcare system, that they will be looked after. And, it's very difficult to break that. The trust that has been broken, it's going to take a long time for them to feel safe again. We don't want any Canadian feeling unsafe when they go into their local hospitals for procedures.
One of the things that we heard that is one of the greatest fears is, will this happen to my daughters? And we hear, yes, it's happening to the daughters. It's happening to the nieces. It's happening to them. We have to stop it.
This leads actually into my next question, which is you mentioned how hard it is to get data to get an idea as to how prevalent this is. Do you have an idea from the research that you've done just how much this is happening present day and maybe where it is happening more frequently?
It's definitely in higher Indigenous populations, that's for sure. We also know it's happening in the African Nova Scotia population as well, because they have with this second report, we've heard testimony from 2 witnesses that said, there's no babies in our community. There are no babies in our community. All the women have been given hysterectomies. So I don't know, like really, I don't have hardcore data. We need that. We need a system. We need a system in place to do that, and I'm hoping that could be part of the compensation package as well.
So just to clarify, some sort of reporting system so that if women or people who have had this done come forward, you can have a way of keeping track of it?
Exactly, and probably a helpline that people can call when it's happened, because the calls that I get is, here's a typical, for instance, call I get. Senator Boyer, I've been trying to have a baby for 5 years, and I can't. And I remember signing a paper a long time ago. And so my response is, I'm going to tell you how to get your health records, and I'm going to help you decipher them. And then we'll go from there. And that's part of what I do, is I help the women one at a time. If they may want legal action, they may not. They may want somebody to talk to. They may want a group of women to talk to, other survivors. They may be very angry. They may need counseling. We send them to counseling that is available to everyone. And we do the best that we can, but I'm a senator. This is not, we need a national dedicated scope for this in every province. And we need a central registry, and we need this to happen now.
And just to add to what my colleague has said, Senator Boy, if you remember, one of the survivors, she didn't even know she had been sterilized. She had been trying to get pregnant, and she didn't know why she couldn't get pregnant until she went for a checkup.
Hi, Marcia McLeod with the Globe and Mail. Thanks for all of your remarks today. I was wondering, with respect to the testimony that you heard from Ms. Lombard around there being no consequences that she was aware of for a forced or coerced sterilization, what you all made of that? Like, what was your reaction to that, or your thoughts on hearing that?
Well, it's true. I mean, that's pretty clear. We have the Northwest Territories case that I'm sure you've heard of, is the young woman had said that she was sterilized against her will in 2019, and the doctor pipes up and said, no, that didn't happen. So we've got, what consequences? Now he's got the CMPA to, help him. He's got bags of money. This woman is probably also working for minimum wage. So what she says is true. What consequences have there been? I know the RCMP did have I had talked to Brenda Lucky, Commissioner Lucky, and she wanted to talk to women that had been sterilized and try to hunt them down, but that didn't work out very well because there's actually no trust between the women that have been sterilized and the police. So then I get the calls from the women saying, there's RCMP at my door. They're demanding to talk to me about who sterilized me. What do I do? Okay, that's part of my job. These women that are in crisis. So no, Ms. Lombard is absolutely correct.
I think what happens is that the survivors, they have to deal with the trauma on their own. Now, thanks to Senator Boyer's effort, there's, help available. And I thank you, Senator Boyer, for, what you do. But it's really not a senator's job to be, doing this. There has to be other practices in place. There has to be someone to, help these women. And I think that's not too much of an ask, that we ask that somebody come forward and help these women and keep records.
Did you have a follow-up?
And apologies, I wasn't trying to imply that or ask you to speak to whether you thought it was true, but more so just whether you felt, the frustration, the anger. My follow-up was just what reaction, Senator Boyer, you received to S250, and kind of what maybe you heard from some folks upon introducing that?
The women are overjoyed. I wanted to introduce it before the end of June so that it would give them a little hope. They've been asking for this for a long time. I've been working in this area for a number of years, and there probably hasn't been a conversation that has gone by that hasn't said, I want to see it criminalized. And it's been me that has been reluctant because the criminal justice system has not been kind to Indigenous people, and especially Indigenous women. And I have been reluctant, but I'm at that point where I think we have to do something. The women have been thrilled. They've been very happy.
Okay, we're going to go to the Canadian press, but we do have another press conference around noon, so if we could just keep the questions and the answers a little bit tighter, that would be greatly appreciated because we still have questions on Zoom as well.
Thank you so much for taking my question. Erica Ibrahim, the Canadian Press. I saw that the first recommendation is for the government to put forward legislation that would make forced and coerced sterilization a criminal offense. And I was wondering whether conversations have begun with the Justice Minister or with any other ministers. I was wondering if you could say more on that.
They're beginning this summer. That's part of what my job is to, I'll be discussing with Minister Lametti and Minister Miller and whoever else we need to discuss this with. It's ongoing. I've got a little work plan all ready to go.
And I'm curious if you can speak to the level of receptiveness of those involved in the conversations to move forward with that recommendation.
With the ministers, we haven't discussed it yet.
Okay.
All right, we're going to go on Zoom. So we're going to start with Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press.
Hi, Senator Boyer. Could you please let me know a bit more about your visit to northern Manitoba, where you said that half the women had this experience? Could you please specify the community, the year of the meeting, and how many women were in that group? No, I won't, sorry. I can tell you that there was probably 200 people in the room. Okay. I'm going to take that as half of the 200, but please correct me. And I just wanted to know about the 12,000 number that you've got. If you could characterize, what percentage of these might date back to the past decade, for example, how many of them are closer to the 1970s? I'm just trying to tease out the prevalence of the cases that you're hearing, if they lean more towards a historical thing, or if this is more quite recent cases, or if it's just sort of unchanged. Well, at the moment, what we're doing is we're putting a map together with a saturation of where women have been sterilized in groups so that they are not identified. So that's something you can keep an eye on my website. That will be up as soon as we can. And historically, we know that there's been, say, for instance, 26% of all the women that lived in Igloolik were sterilized. We know that there's, Senator Toulejean mentioned the North. We've heard bits and pieces throughout Canada. The best way I can answer your question is to just wait until our maps are out, and we're working diligently on that as well. And historically, we are trying to go back as far as we can to find out what Indigenous women were sterilized during when eugenics were the law in British Columbia and Alberta, and so we're going back that far as best we can. So we've got people working on it. Thank you. Sorry, if I can add the importance of, if women knew, no matter which generation, knew clearly and understanding clearly of what we're doing today, we would have so many calls. And just in Quebec, since when we finished the national inquiry, we started to have some
women who wanted to come and speak about this, but we had to close and went down the national inquiry. But we knew that Senator Boyer was working on this. So in Quebec, more and more we will hear some women didn't know that they have a, I don't know what it is in English, un stérilet. They were forced or imposed of taking this medication so they won't have any children, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many places, I'm sure, because it's not officially, what's the right, people don't know or they didn't hear about this. In some region, you would see the numbers increasing. Some passed away, sad to say, and some are still alive. And we have young women who didn't understand that they had the right. Even at the Joliette Hospital, Joyce Echaquan was forced to think about to do this action also. There's many stories that didn't reach us yet. So we have to remember that there's places, more we will explain, more we will share, that it's possible to come and share their stories or to be part of this. I have a strong feeling that the numbers will, sadly to say, increase.
And last question on Zoom will go to Palak Mangat from Politics Today.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. This is for, I would suspect, Senator Boyer as well. I did have a question around sort of the level of support you've gotten from the government, but I do take your point that conversations haven't begun and they will throughout the summer. I'm wondering, do you have thoughts on what kind of, I guess, proactive efforts need to be made from officials to kind of become alert to this and understand where it could be happening? I know that, I don't know whether the right word is, what signs there are, but I'm just curious around how effectively officials can actually identify instances where this might be happening, or does that expertise currently exist at all in your mind?
Well, the main thing is survivors have to be talked to. If the government is consulting with people who are not survivors and getting all their information from other sources, then they don't have very valid information. So that's number one, is the survivors have to be consulted themselves. They have to direct the process. And that's something I've been saying the whole time. It has to be that way, or don't bother doing it.
And just my follow-up is sort of around the recommendation around data collection too. And it says, that's an effort to better understand sort of the scale of the problem. And I guess my question is just, is there a difficulty of governments sort of retroactively shedding a light on this, and how do you hope to address some of the fears that because it is underreported, not everyone may be captured and some people may inevitably fall through the cracks?
Well, that's true. I know that there is jurisdictional difficulty with the federal and provincial governments, and Senator Odette mentioned that a little bit earlier with Quebec not attending. I believe there was a roundtable in about 2019 that Quebec did not attend, and the provinces and the federal government had put a roundtable together to look at some of these issues, and then we had COVID and things just sort of fell away. The federal government has worked very hard at addressing racism in healthcare, and I have to say that they have worked hard in that. There are very many provincial initiatives going on, even in British Columbia, the First Nations Health Authority, and some of the BC physicians are working in women's maternal health, and they're doing a really good job in their consent forms and making sure that the consent is actually a valid, it's free, prior, and informed. And I have been working with them on that as well. So I think BC right now is a leader in the area. These are things that really need to come from a national body. And we need to be looking at a national body, like I said, that is inclusive of the federal government and the provincial governments, and working together to eradicate this once and for all.
All right, so these are all the questions we had, and this will end the press conference. So thank you so much for your time and for answering all the reporters' great questions, and wishing you a great day. Merci beaucoup.